Section 3.2, Properties of Matter. Physical and chemical properties. These are very different from each other. The definition for a physical property is something that can be observed without changing the molecules or atoms. So for example, if I take a piece of paper and I rip it in half, I'm not changing the paper. It's still paper, I just now have two pieces instead of one. Chemical property, you end up with something new. So in the process of looking or testing something, the atoms change into a different substance. So for example, if I have a nail and it rusts, that iron has now turned into iron oxide. It reacted with the oxygen in the air, and it has become something totally different. Intensive versus extensive properties. These are a little more difficult to understand. Intensive property, the size of the sample doesn't matter. So if you have a big piece or a small piece of something, the property stays the same. So an example of that would be if you have a swimming pool full of water, the density of that water is still going to be 1.0 grams per centimeter cubed. If I have a teaspoon of water or a cup of water, the density is going to be 1.0 grams per centimeter cubed. That will not change no matter how much I have. Extensive property, the size of the sample does matter. So a big piece versus a small piece would make that property different. So if I had, let's say, a swimming pool full of water and I needed to know the mass of that, the mass of a swimming pool of water would be much bigger than the mass of a cup of water. So that would be how an extensive property is different than an intensive property. So let's look at a couple examples here. Physical versus chemical properties. Flammability means whether something can burn or not. So if something burns, typically you're going to end up with ashes and smoke is going to be given off or some type of a gas. So you're going to end up with something different than you started with. So flammability would be a chemical property. Boiling point, let's talk about water. If water boils, water is going to turn into steam. Steam and water are both exactly the same thing. They're H2O. So you have not changed what you have, so that's going to be a physical property. Solubility. This means whether something will dissolve in water typically. So if I take salt and I dissolve it in water, I'm not changing the salt, it's just dissolving. I can still get that salt back, I can still get the water back by boiling the water off. I can condense it and get the water, and then the salt will be left in the beaker. So both of those things still have the same properties. Malleability means stretching something into, pounding something into a thin sheet, typically a metal. So if I take a piece of aluminum that's in a cube and I pound it into a flat sheet of aluminum foil, it's still aluminum and has not changed, so that would be a physical change. Reactivity with oxygen. Reactivity tells us it's reacting. If something reacts, it changes into something different. So this would be the example of rust. Oxygen and iron react, we get rust. So those are some examples of physical and chemical properties. Now, intensive versus extensive. Mass. If I have a pool of a pool of water, or if I have a cup of water, the mass will not be the same in both those situations. Okay, so this is going to be an extensive property. It's not the same. If I take the volume of that swimming pool of water and the volume of that cup of water, they are not going to be the same. So that is also an extensive property. Color. If I look at the color of a cup of water versus the color of the swimming pool, it's going to be the same. Or if I look at a piece of paper, when I have a stack of paper versus just one sheet of paper, it's going to be the same. So that's intensive. Flammability. Typically, if something burns, it's going to burn no matter whether you have a little bit or a lot. So again, if you have a piece of paper, you can usually light that on fire fairly easily. If you have a ream of paper or 500 sheets of paper, it's going to burn the same. So that's also going to be intensive. Texture is another one. If I have a piece of material, the texture is going to be the same whether I have a little sample of that material or a whole outfit made out of that material. So that is also intensive. So those are some examples that show the difference between physical and chemical properties and intensive and extensive properties.